What's going on, guys? It's Nick here, back with another video. A bit of a different one today. I didn't have this one on the schedule, but I've seen far too many comments about this topic, so figured had to make a video going over it. Today, I'll be going over the thinking behind drafting volatile players, the pros and cons behind it, which players kind of fall into this category, or you think that do, but actually don't, and if I recommend targeting these types of players or not. So the video should actually be pretty informative, just one that's a little bit different from my usual breakdowns. If you end up liking this video, well then please leave a like on the video, and it shows me that you might enjoy this sort of content, and I'll do it more in the future. If you hate it, then let me know why you didn't like it in the comment section below, and I'll try to improve on whatever you don't like. One comment that I don't want to see, though, is about timestamps. We have timestamps in every single video, have for like 2 or 3 years now, so please stop asking for them. You can always see exactly when we're going to talk about the first player by looking at like the bottom of the video. There's that little bar where you can drag the time. You can see chunks. You know exactly when and for how long we're going to talk about every single topic, every single player. This one's a little bit different since it's not about specific players, but in general, if you want to just skip over stat of the day and go straight to the first player, you just got to click a button and it'll go right there. But a lot of people do enjoy the stat of the day, so without further ado, we'll hop into that one. Yesterday's stat: 2 tight ends last season had a pass attempt. Travis Kelce led the way with 2. Who else had one? I'm recording this a little bit early, so I don't know who's going to get it, but I will add the winners to the graphic on the screen so that you know. The answer is Logan Thomas. He was the only other tight end to attempt a pass. Today's stat: sticking with tight end, which tight end had the most rushing yards last season? And for this one, we're not counting Taysom Hill. He was a quarterback for this one, so don't count him as a tight end. What tight end had the most rushing yards last season? All right, let's talk about volatile players. So the comments that I'm referring to reference players with a high ceiling and a low floor. That's what I'm talking about with volatile. Their production is volatile. And it's easy. It's an easy answer to be like, well, I like this player in best ball, wouldn't touch him in redraft leagues. The thinking being that they might finish high in points per game at the end of the season, but it's not, a full season league. You play every single week, and the value they add to your team might not be as high because they hurt you when they have those duds, and the points per game only shows the average across a whole season. Think about Tyler Lockett last year. Finished 9th overall, 12th in points per game, but he scored 32.5 in week 3, 45.5 in week 7, 27 in week 17. Aside from those 3 weeks, he averaged 8.5 fantasy points per game, which is wide receiver 57 production last season, otherwise known as not very good, right? Not very helpful. So, like I said, he finished 12th in points per game, but it certainly felt a lot worse than that if you owned him last season. So if you want to fade Lockett this season because you think last season will continue, you don't buy into him being injured last season, you think that they're still going to run the ball a ton, so you don't buy into any of that hype for passing the ball more, you think that Metcalf is clearly their number 1, then I'm 100% on board. That's what you believe is going to happen. Don't draft him. If you don't want to draft him, don't draft him. This video is not going to tell you that every single player who only has 3 good games in a season and you think that's going to continue, you should go out and draft. That's absolutely not what I'm going to say in this video. But could we have expected Lockett to be so up and down last season? He scored fewer than 10 fantasy points, which for this video, I'm going to consider a bust. Sure, if you're like the wide receiver 60 and you score 8 fantasy points, that's not technically a bust. It was probably what we should expect from you. But if you're starting a player and they score in the single digits in a half PPR league, you're disappointed. So that's where you're using his bust, less than 10 fantasy points. It's not a great week. And so again, he did that in, 63% of his games last season, but that was after doing so in just 38% in 2018 and 38% in 2019. Lockett definitely had some spiked weeks, but he was never considered a boom-bust player heading into last season. And that's my first point. We're not that great at predicting things in general, but we're especially not good at predicting who's going to have these up and down seasons. They can easily come from players that we typically view as consistent. You know, who would have thought entering last season, Michael Thomas would have fewer than 10 fantasy points in 4 of his 7 games, right? Or that Curtis Samuel would have more than 10 fantasy points in 8 of his last 10, despite busting in 56% of his games just a year prior. Situations change. Players improve. They regress. Offenses get lucky and unlucky with touchdowns. Expecting everyone to produce exactly like they've done in the past is a losing strategy. Things change, and your ability to predict what's going to change matters, right? So there's that. But my biggest arguments are twofold here, right? First, people anchor wide receivers and really everyone, all players, into narratives even when they've been proven to be untrue. And second, the majority of people overweight the negative impact that a bust has on your season, and they underweight the positive impact that a ceiling week has. Now, that second point I just made is totally understandable, right? There have been a ton of studies looking at negative events and why statistically losses feel about twice as bad as wins feel good. We just naturally overreact when things go wrong and don't feel nearly as good when they go well. So when a player has been producing for us and then he busts, he has a terrible week, we get super upset even if we knew deep down they weren't going to go off every single week. Think back to Calvin Ridley last year. He went off most weeks, but I bet you remember when he had 0 receptions on 4 targets, right? And I bet you were super upset when that happened, even though he was still, after that 0 through 4 weeks, so 25% of his games was 0, he was the wide receiver 1 overall. You were still probably really upset, and you probably got him like the 4th or the 5th round, right? That week was annoying at the time, but realistically, it had very little impact on your season overall. You were still definitely set up to make the playoffs and produce well in the playoffs if you had Calvin Ridley on your roster, since he was the 4th most valuable wide receiver last season in terms of wins above replacement. Because at the end of the day, he had so many good games that he more than made up for the dud. And even with the dud, you could have still won, right? You have other players on your roster, you can make up for one poor performance. But I want to go back to that first point. We anchor wide receivers, and again, all players in general, into narratives, even when they are proven false or proven largely inaccurate. This entire video was created because you guys just refuse to draft Mike Evans since he's too volatile. It's what I hear all the time. He's too volatile of a player. This coming after he's posted his 7th consecutive 1,000-yard season to start his career, something no one has ever done before, after a season where he finished as the 10th most valuable wide receiver in terms of wins above replacements. Only 9 wide receivers were more valuable to have on your team than Mike Evans last year. That's ahead of Keenan Allen, A.J. Brown, Will Fuller, Robert Woods, basically everyone else that you'd think would be lesser than those guys. And it was after a season where he posted less than 10 fantasy points in only 38% of his games. The same as Lockett the 2 years before this last one, but also the same as Justin Jefferson in his historic season, Allen Robinson, despite finishing 3rd overall in targets, Robert Woods, Juju, players that everyone views as consistent, busted at the exact same rate as Mike Evans. And his 38% was a lower bust rate than guys like Adam Thielen, who busted in 40% of his games, DeAndre Hopkins, who busted in 44% of his games, DJ Moore busted in 47%, Lockett, of course, 63%. The list just goes on and on. People even want to call Amari Cooper boom bust because of his days in Oakland, even though he's been with Dallas for 2 years now, with most of that time, or I guess a good chunk of that time, coming without Dak Prescott. He's only busted in 32% of his games, so even fewer than all of those names I just mentioned. People are absolutely confusing consistency with a lack of a ceiling. So they'll say a player is consistent, but what they really mean is he never goes off. People love to say that Jarvis Landry is consistent. No, over the last 3 years, so since joining Cleveland, he's scored single-digit fantasy points in 53% of his games, while going over 20% only 11% of the time. So sure, you can call him consistent if you mean that he's consistently not that good, okay? You don't want quote unquote consistency. You want high ceiling players because when they hit, you win games. And even if you manage to draft a team with all consistent players, something no one is ever going to do, you're going to have busts, okay? But somehow you manage to draft a team with no busts, there's a bunch of consistent players. Let's pretend you managed to pull that off. You're probably still going to make the playoffs and lose before the finals because you're going to run into a team that has a spiked week from certain players, and that's going to be more than enough to put them over the edge. You're going to consistently be in that like 115 point range, and you're going to get stomped by teams that drop 160 because you don't have players who are capable of posting 30. So when you run into a team who's got a bunch of studs and they have two guys go off for 25, 30 points, how are you making up for that with your team of guys who gets you like 12 to 14 every week? Sure, it feels nice that they don't bust, or don't bust because it's a complete and utter lie that they don't bust, but sure, it'll feel good in this theoretical scenario where they don't bust, but you have no ceiling. Winning a championship is difficult, okay? You have to beat in a 12-team league, which I think is what most of you play in, you got to beat 11 other teams. So playing it safe is just dumb, okay? You're going to run into bust. So if you also avoid these volatile players, then you won't have the weekly ceiling to make up for it when your consistent players bust. Because again, every single player has a weekly floor of 0 points. And even the studs are going to bust from time to time. So if you fill your roster with players who don't have that weekly ceiling, you won't be able to overcome those busts when they absolutely occur, and you're just not going to win a championship as a result. And I want to make it abundantly clear, we're not good at identifying which players are boom and bust. And most of the time, the players people mention boom bust are not boom bust. They're boom, having 30, 40 point ceilings, but when they bust, it's the same thing that their consistent players are doing every single week. It's a bust for 10 points, okay? When you have a consistent player, they're just doing that every week, okay? You gotta be targeting players who have a massive weekly ceiling because it makes up for it when the players you thought were consistent post 7. Now, there are certainly players I would avoid this season because I think they'll be up and down. But there's a very important distinction to be made there. I'm avoiding certain players because I don't trust their volume or their situation, right? So I believe the volume will be inconsistent, leading to that up and down production because either they're not that good, the quarterback play is not that good, the offense isn't that good, but I'm not avoiding them because of the floor. Instead, it's because the ceiling, it just isn't there. I'm willing to assume a very low weekly floor, or at least a presumed low weekly floor, if I believe that the upside is there for a lot of high ceiling weeks. But if a player doesn't have that ceiling in the range of outcomes, why would I bother drafting them, right? Why even draft someone whose best outcome is that they keep hitting on touchdowns, they use more than we think, and they're consistently getting you like 15? Because you know they're still going to mix in for busts around 30 to 40% of the time. So they're getting 15, a lot, but then those bad weeks are getting you like 5. Why even draft a player like that doesn't have that ceiling? At least target players who could occasionally drop 25 and win you a week because their floor very, very likely is the exact same as those consistent players. So if you want to see a full list of players that I would be avoiding this season, because I do think their target share will be inconsistent, their offense will be inconsistent, and they just don't have that ceiling, as long with players that I would be targeting because I think that they're in a great situation or that the talent is absolutely there, you can always check that out at our website, thefantasyfootballadvice.com. But that'll do it for this video. Please, please, please let me know if you liked this style of video, talking about these situations more as a whole, not necessarily a specific player, although we kind of went over Mike Evans for a bit. Again, Evans, a guy I really want to be targeting. He's safe. He's got weekly upside, and I'm not scared of this quote-unquote boom-bust nature of his game because it's simply not true. If you like this style of video and you watch this far, let's be honest, you at least somewhat liked it. How about leaving a like button? Really helps me out. And let me know if there are other topics you want to see me go over. Put them in the comment section. I'll try to make a video talking about them specifically. That, my friends, is the end of this one. Hope you all enjoy. If you did, then how about hitting that like button? And how about subscribing to the channel if you're new here? Thanks for watching.